Ladies and gents, welcome back. It's amazing to watch in real time the hypocrisy of our government and our mainstream media and their reporting on the same situation, but in two different places. We have protests sparking across China for their COVID lockdown policies and what's happening there. And it's amazing how different their coverage is compared to, well, protests against lockdowns here in Canada. We have here from CTV News, Glen McGregor reporting on, well, the case in China.
CTV's senior political correspondent Glen McGregor on the rare displays of public dissent.
A heavy police presence on the streets of Beijing to discourage demonstrations against strict zero COVID measures that brought thousands out in major cities across China. Now inspiring shows of support in the UK, in Hong Kong, and in Australia. The uprising is drawing comparisons to the 1989 student revolt at Tiananmen Square, a test of China's resolve to continue lockdowns and forced testing as cases climb, and a direct challenge to its authoritarian leader.
Mind you, these are all things that happened with the Canadian protest. We had support from across the world. When that came about, that was seen as troublesome. That was seen as a problem when the rest of the world was waving Canadian flags in protest against government lockdowns. But that was seen by CTV News as an issue and an embarrassment for Canada, when we all seen it as a moment of pride.
I find this extremely courageous on the part of people to call for Xi Jinping to step down.
Stop the Uyghur genocide! At a small protest at the University of Ottawa, where China's ambassador to Canada spoke, exchange students worried about family back home.
We know exactly how it's going to end. They're going to stage a fake violent incidents, and they're going to plan it on protesters, like what they done to Hong Kong like 3 years ago. I have no...
Wait, so they're going to let them talk about this and not call it a conspiracy theory. We see what's going on here, and I support these protesters, and I understand what they're saying. Yeah, they're going to try to say that something violent's going on and tell us that a peaceful protest is actually a big violent thing. Oh, okay. Where have we heard that before?
No prediction about what's going to happen next, but I'm supporting them 100%.
There is economic risk too. Shares in Apple dropped today on concerns about its supply chain.
Clearly, China as a major economic player, and China still struggling with COVID, there's an impact on the economy.
China's potential for disruption was addressed in Canada's new Indo-Pacific strategy unveiled this weekend, but no comment so far on the anti-lockdown protests.
Will they indicate to Beijing that the peaceful protest should be allowed to go ahead and that any crackdown should be resisted?
In an attempt to keep the protests under control, the Chinese government is censoring online discussion and even removing images of massless soccer fans at Qatar from China's World Cup feed.
Hey, what do you know? The media is trying to do stuff in China to squash the protest. Hey, what was Glen McGregor, Mr. Glen McGregor right here, what was he reporting on at the time? Well, he made it a personal vendetta to go after these individual truckers at the protests by tracking them down and trying to point out to the police that they were doing something that was actually quite lawful. Of course, people were saying, "How dare they bring fuel into town? This is dangerous," or something like that. No, these are legal vessels to carry fuel in, and they were fueling up their trucks to stay warm in the winter time. They were trying to use this as a way to shut down the protest. And Glen McGregor making it his own personal vendetta against the truckers. The cops told me the cans could be filled with water, so they aren't doing anything. They aren't. And, well, even people in the comments saying, so sad to read these comments coming from people. They're fighting for freedom of choice. Everyone should be backing them up. Now, it's just unbelievable. In China right now, this sparked because there was a fire in a building. While the COVID lockdowns were so strict in China, they were actually wiring people's doors shut. While there was a fire at a building, a number of people were injured and died in that event, which sparked a giant protest across China. And this is huge. This is unlike anything we've ever seen. and it's all about government authoritarianism and their overreach, stepping too far, tracking people with, let me guess, QR codes. Yeah. So all the things that protesters in Canada were trying to avoid happened in China, and it went that extra step a little too far. Now, Justin Trudeau had a few words to say about the protesters. Here's what he had to say.
The small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa.
Oh, sorry. I got the wrong one. He's talking about people with unacceptable views in Canada. What did he have to say about the Chinese protesters? Well, Xi Jinping condemns protesters, refers to them as a fringe minority with unacceptable views. Now, this is, of course, a fake headline for CNN.com, but here's what Trudeau himself actually had to say.
Canadians are watching very closely. Obviously, everyone in China should be allowed to express themselves, should be allowed to share their perspectives and indeed protest. We're going to continue to ensure that China knows we'll stand up for human rights, we'll stand with people who are expressing themselves. We also need to make sure that China and places around the world are respecting journalists and their ability to do their job. We'll continue to make that very clear.
Oh, is that right? Is that absolutely right? That's what Trudeau is going to stand up for the rights of protesters. Golly. He did for those in India, and he did for those in China now. And, well, does he do the same thing for Canadians here? Well, we have here from Canada's website, travel.gc.ca. Be careful when traveling to China. Exercise a high degree of caution, they say. Safety and security demonstrations are happening. Risk level. China exercise high degree of caution, China, due to its risk of arbitrary enforcement of local laws. We saw that with the use of the Emergencies Act here in Canada. They're giving, travelers the heads up. I like how they even point out Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. They have getaway tours for people where they can go and think for a long time. I think they call them concentration camps. That's a thing that's happening over there. We have the media in lockstep with Trudeau immediately. We got Happy Gilmore over here getting right in there. Canada stands with the people expressing themselves amid China's COVID-19 protests. You can't make this up, people. You just can't make this up. It's insane. I don't know what to even think about it. The cognitive dissonance inside your head to be able to share these two mutually exclusive views about the same thing. Just like being able to think about protests in Canada as insurrection and protests in China for the same thing as being something we should all be standing for. It's insane. It's insane. But Trudeau was saying only a week ago, he said protesting to demand policy change is worrisome. Well, it's worrisome if it's happening here in Canada and it's his policies that people want to change. Now we see how it works. We see how it works when the shoe's on the other foot, and the Canadian dictator, he's been ruling as a dictator. And I don't say this, I don't say that with too much hyperbole. I mean, I know it's a hyperbolic statement, but it's actually accurate. When somebody rules a country by dictate, it's not like the COVID-19. They weren't even laws. They were just provisions. They were measures enforced against Canadians, but they weren't put in place by passing a bill, going to the House of Commons, passing it with our elected officials, and then going to the Senate and then passing it there. No, it was an emergency, and it was doled out by government decree from the executive branch. You can't say that by ruling by dictate, you are not a dictator. And this is what is happening here in Canada. And I disagree with the way things have been going. And I support the people in China for the same things. Avi Yemini having a great take on this, saying much the same thing.
Watching the mainstream media report on anti-lockdown protesters in China, labeling them brave, which they are. But in comparison to the reporting not so long ago here in the West, where they named anyone who dared to protest as conspiracy theorists, they were protesting the exact same thing. But the person that has to take the cake on his hypocrisy and double standard is Justin Trudeau himself.
Obviously, everyone in China should be allowed to express themselves, should be allowed to share their perspectives and indeed protest. We're going to continue to ensure that China knows we'll stand up for human rights, we'll stand with people who are expressing themselves.
Look in the mirror, you tyrant! That was you! Exactly the same thing! You did it! In Canada!
And not even a year ago. We're talking about back in February. We haven't even come up to the anniversary of a year since the Freedom Convoy, and we've already got a completely different opinion from the same people. From the same people who have been, up until this point, still so vitriolic against protesters in Canada for the same thing. I'll leave that with you guys. Leave a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know how infuriated you are, or how anyway, start that conversation in the comment section down below. We'll see you in the next one. Keep on trucking.